And thanks to the Laramie County government who is letting us use this beautiful room. It used to be a courtroom, free of charge. The county is streaming it online there, and then will give us the recording of it. We'll hope to have it on the league website shortly, within a few days. And also, as I mentioned, make it available for local access cable TV. Just a reminder, the Republican and Democratic primaries are August 19th. Early voting has begun, and what you'll be doing is selecting the candidates to advance to the general election on November 4th. Remember, you can register at the polls. This is a very important election when we will choose U.S. Senator, Congressman, and top 5 elected officials that are named in the state constitution, Superintendent of Public Instruction being one of them. You also will elect 60 Wyoming House candidates and 15 Wyoming Senate candidates in addition to your local offices, and they will run your government for the next 2 to 4 years. In addition, will be a constitutional amendment on your ballot November 4th, and it is to open up eligibility for the University of Wyoming trustees to non-state residents. And so just a word about the League of Women Voters. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization open to anyone old enough to vote, that is men and women. The League of Women Voters, we welcome men. We do not support one candidate over another, but we do advocate for issues and we lobby on them on the local, state, and national levels. We advocate for open, accountable government and for people to participate in their government. Our voter service activities support our statement, be informed and vote. The forums tonight and tomorrow night are designed to provide information in addition to other resources. We hope voters will go out and check the candidates' websites, look at their information, gather information from wherever you can so that you will know how to vote. The League of Women Voters prepared several questions for the candidates tonight. They have had those questions for a week. There also will be time for questions from the audience. And so what we have is the 3x5 index cards. And members of the League, there's Margaret back there with some. We have some on the podium over there. If during the evening a question occurs to you, maybe something the candidates have said or a burning question you've had all along, write it down on the cards. We'll collect them, and we'll try to get to as many as possible this evening. The ones we can't get to tonight, we definitely will put in, we'll draw upon those for an online voter's guide. So again, if you have a question, put them on a 3x5 card, and we will try to get to it tonight. Just a word about the format. And by the way, the order of candidates was purely random, literally names pulled out of a hat in that order. So the format is there will be a 2-minute opening from each candidate. Then we will have questions, again, we've several by the League, and then whatever we get from the audience, for a 1.5 minutes to respond. Then we will open it up if a candidate wants to expand on his or her answers or respond to another. We'll give them a few seconds to do that for each question. And the order of beginning will rotate among the candidates. So everybody will be first at some point, several times during the evening. The timing will be we have Pat here to timing. She has the cards, and so for the benefit of the candidates, the yellow is the 30-second card countdown, 15-second for the orange, and the shocking pink is stop. So if you can just out of your peripheral vision, keep track of those as time gets short, and then the timer will also beep as a little reminder. And then finally, when we're done, the candidates will have 2 minutes to sum up. You can use these statements, opening and closing, any way you want, to introduce yourself, to address an issue that we haven't raised. Use it any way you want, and that should consume our 90 minutes fairly well. The evening will go quickly. And now I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight is Kathy Carpin. She served 2 terms as Secretary of State for Wyoming in 1986 and 1990 to 1994. She was appointed by President Clinton as Director of the Federal Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement in the Department of the Interior, 1997 through 2000. Currently, she practices law in Cheyenne, and this is her second forum tonight, so she's in a groove. She'll be going. There we go. And I know that all of you here, well, most of you here probably support one or more of these candidates. So we're going to ask if you can sort of keep the comments to yourself for this evening. And but certainly we know that you're here in support of your candidates. And again, if you have a question, we have Margaret. The card, well, she's back there. She's back there in the corner, busily on her phone. But anyway, she's going to. If you have a card, write it on. Write your question, and we will bring it up here and give it to Kathy as we're wrapping up the league questions. So I will turn the podium over to Kathy Carpin.
Thank you, Marguerite, and good evening, candidates. We will start out now with the opening statements, and we'll begin left to right, and then we'll ask the questions and rotate over as Marguerite indicated. So, Ms. Lane, we'll begin with you with your 2-minute opening.
Thank you very much, and thank you, League of Women Voters, and all of you who came out tonight. I am Cheryl Lane. I'm running for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I grew up in Park County on a homestead some years ago, and my dad was an ag teacher. Graduated from Powell High School and then went on with my high school sweetheart to UW, where we have, our whole family may have up to, 10 or 12 degrees from UW. I began to teach in 1968, and I taught at a little school called Morton School. It now is consolidated, and taught English there, moved on and taught at Riverton High School, where my husband was a pioneer at CWC at the college there, and then followed him to the Wyoming Department of Ed in the mid-1970s and began teaching in Cheyenne. I am a person with 40-plus years of experience in the classroom, at administrative level leadership here in Cheyenne, and in coaching schools all around the state. There are about 350 schools. I've been in about 220 of them. And where I go, the scores tend to go up. Star Valley High School still has the highest reading scores. ARP, Meadowlark, a variety of schools became national winning schools. At that point in time, I began working at Cary Junior High, a school that needed improvement. That school grew 30 points in special education. I came then to the Department of Ed. I come to the decision to run for the state superintendent because my background has groomed me for it. I didn't groom myself. And I'm really concerned that we focus again on parents, teachers, and students. This means a cutback in federalizing, a cutback in the centralizing here in Cheyenne, and a focus on where it really happens, and that is right in the schools and right in the classrooms.
Thank you. And I forgot to request, but you did it fine. But the candidates, please speak into your microphone so those in the back can hear. And now, Ms. Bella, from you.
Balo is my last name. Thank you.
Well, I asked and somebody misled me.
That's
I'm
okay.
Sorry, I apologize.
And I'm also barely above 5 feet, and I'm wondering where the JCPenney catalogs are. So I'm sitting on my knee at the risk of it falling asleep. My name is Jillian Balo. I'm a Republican candidate for Superintendent of Public Instruction. I thank the League of Women Voters, and thank you, Kathy, for inviting us here tonight for this important opportunity. I want to start with just a little bit about myself. Most folks in Wyoming know me by my maiden name, which is McGarvin. My dad's out in the audience tonight. And I was a teacher for 10 years in Wyoming. I taught in Hewlett and in Gillette. That's after growing up in Wyoming schools. I'm a fifth-generation Wyomingite. My folks are both from the Bighorn Basin. As a teacher, I was a leader in the classroom, in the school, and in our community, and I'm very proud of the work that I did. After I finished my master's degree, instead of moving into an administrative role within the school, I went to state government, where I began working at the Department of Education, worked side by side with school districts doing the very same thing that I'm advocating for in my campaign now, and that is providing opportunities for school districts to build their capacity to be successful. From there, I moved on to the governor's office, where I was a policy advisor. I worked again shoulder to shoulder with communities, local governments on infrastructure issues, and I know a little too much about water tanks and landfill remediation to fill a book. So I again worked side by side also with other state agencies and learned how that works. From there, I became a DFS administrator, where I oversee a large staff across the state, a large budget, and have firsthand, with a strong team of leaders and staff, work to transform government and make government work better for the people. I'm excited about this opportunity to run. It is time to refocus, heal, and move forward in education, and a strong leader in the position of state superintendent is very critical right now.
Thank you. Excuse me. And Mr. Winnie?
Good evening. My name is Bill Winnie, candidate for State Superintendent of Public Instruction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with the League of Women Voters. I've observed Marguerite Herman up there in the galleries over the past 10 years. But I grew up on a nuclear submarine. For those of you that have seen the movie or read the book Hunt for Red October, I've done that kind of stuff, and that's where I grew up. Now, on the other hand, training and education was a daily part of that business. And even more important for me, understanding how people learn was a career-spanning responsibility. Well, you know, about 12 weeks ago, I was sitting down with my wife over breakfast, and I saw her teach wherever we landed as the Navy moved us around for 30 years, and I saw the good and the bad of school administrations through her eyes. And I got to kind of talking about things, and I said, you know, I've run big organizations. I've run big budgets, bigger than the Wyoming state budget. I've been inside bureaucracies. I know how bureaucracies capture their bosses. And I said, you know, I could do something about this education thing here in Wyoming. Well, as you might imagine, she looked at me over her cup of hot tea and said, okay, get up off your rear end and go do it. So that's why I'm here. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Sabias.
I'm Mike Sabias, and again, thanks. I'm Mike Sabias. Again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I've spent 30 years of a career with Quest Communication, and in that job, it's a very complex business. The last 14 of it was here in Wyoming as a state president. We had many difficult issues that we had to work through, but one of them was providing broadband services to all of the schools in the state. And it didn't come without controversy, but it worked through in a process that really got me involved with this. It was then Governor Geringer who asked me to get involved from a business perspective to represent that interest in education. He just said business wasn't doing enough. So over those years since then, served with every superintendent, requests they've made, with every governor, and a multitude of task forces, from standard setting to the Hathaway Scholarship to just general policy. With all of that, though, the interest that I want to talk to you about is just where I started. My family, my grandfather, my mother, my sister, all were educators. My dad was on the school board, actually, in our little community, so those were really interesting conversations, particularly around salary times at the dinner table. But what we did find out there was how important it was. And the story I'd like to tell you is that my dad learned English as a second language. So before we had English language learners, that's what he was. And what I discovered is he was not accepted into kindergarten because of an accent. But on the other hand, it was education that helped him become what he was. And at the end of his life, he was lauded by our communities. I see the strengths of education and what we can do, and also know how important it is for all of us to be involved. And that's why I am interested in this office.
Thank you very much. And now we will start with the first question. We will start with you, Ms. Lane. The Superintendent of Public Instruction is part politician, part educational leader, part administrator for the Department of Education. How important is the administrator's role, fiscal and personnel management skills?
Thank you. I see the role of a superintendent of public instruction is really sort of tied together, braided together, the politician, the administrator, and the leader. And through the political process, the people then have their voice and vote. And the people elect the superintendent based upon their notion of integrity and the vision offered by that candidate. And my vision is to have the best schools in Wyoming, the best public schools in the United States. So I believe that what we can do with that is to reassert local control. So superintendent appoints a deputy and other leaders to oversee the day-to-day operations. Together we align the work of the agency around the vision that I expressed as a political entity out there. And so I believe that the current challenge here is that we have many bosses with different agendas. The State Board of Education appointed by the governor, the U.S. Department of Education with its federal agenda, and the state bureaucracy. And I understand this, having served the last 3.5 years, almost 4 now, in the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction in the Wyoming Department of Education. And I understand these conflicts, and I believe that we need to clarify the roles of authority. So the administrator then has middle managers, many of whom are very competent at the department. They manage the budgets and they supervise. And then the deputy, the leaders, and the superintendent align the vision. That's my forte as an educational leader. Already I've been contacted by legislators who want to work together because they seek understanding. They're uncomfortable with micromanaging, and they want the big picture. They want to fulfill their role to fund education, and they want what I want, which is to have fabulous Wyoming schools.
Thank you. And now Ms. Balo.
Thank you. If by politician you mean campaigning and getting elected, that ends day one in office, and it becomes more all about fulfilling public will. As an educational leader, you facilitate a vision. The importance of the state superintendent as an administrator cannot be underestimated. It is so important. As a DFS administrator, I have the success and the experience of administering multiple state and federal programs, a large statewide staff, and a large and dynamic budget. I know that being a leader or a teacher leader cannot be equated to being a successful administrator. Here are a few successes that set me apart as an administrator of a large agency. I create and I uphold a climate where employees are valued, where they're respected, and where they're empowered. I understand federal and state employee laws. I lead and manage with ethics, and I take the law seriously and I abide by it. I value the competitive bidding process for contracts. I know how to facilitate interagency work and intra-agency work. I have credibility with my staff and with the state, and I have recruited and retained top leaders and staff in the state. This will be imperative as we begin to heal a broken system. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Winnie.
Superintendent of Public Instruction is the chief advocate for education in the state. Politician, leader, administrator, take your pick. They all kind of roll together. Politician means you have to know how to work with the legislature and talk with those guys and get them on board with things you want to do. It's not enough to just keep the wheels turning and the paperwork moving as an administrator. It's important that you manage the money. You know, I see in my time observing in the galleries of the legislature, I've seen my share of studies that got reported out. And there's something I learned in my time on active duty in the Washington, D.C. arena, which is you can always get a PhD to do something that you want to do, and they'll give you the answer you want. And they'll also charge you a pretty penny to do that. You got to manage the money. You got to make sure it's handled correctly. But that's not enough. You have to lead. You have to get out and talk to your people. You never know where the good ideas are going to come from. You have to get out and talk to the people of the state. Thus far in my campaign, I started in early June. I've probably hit about 10 or 12,000 doors, which means I've talked to maybe 3,500 to 4,000 people. There's some unhappy parents out there. They want something done. The superintendent has to take action on that too.
Thank you. Mr. Ceballos.
Yes, in every respect, this is an administrative role. It's just like being a president or a CEO of a company. What you have to understand is you have to provide direction and leadership to an organization. And clearly, as you look at these roles, one of the things that you know is the first thing that a CEO does is he or she has to respect the employees that they have in that organization. It's critical to make an organization run to have that human resource element there. Equally, you have to lead the financial aspects, and particularly in government, with all the constraints that are there. If you don't do the right things, not only are you going to waste money, but you're going to be in trouble with the legislature. And it's indicative of what's happened over the last few years. Clearly, the leadership skills that were needed in the department are not there, and that's why we've had these ongoing problems, both with the legislature and then ultimately with citizens. There's great disagreement, and it needs to be solved. So what you're doing is you're making sure in this job that you're retaining and hiring the best and the brightest, that you're using the funds as you need to use them. And these are functions that I've done for a 30-year career and feel just ultimately qualified to be able to do this because it's a very similar organization, managing complex subject matter experts to provide service to districts.
Would anyone like to comment on another's statements?
I would.
Ms. Lane?
Thank you. I'd like to express this notion. We hear several of my opponents talking about a broken system, issues related to the last several years of how the Department of Ed went. And I would like to offer to you that SF 104 created a great deal of unease, even chaos. And SF 104 meant you had first an elected superintendent, then an appointed interim, and then an appointed for a few months of a director.
I'm afraid we're going to have to cut
And
you off,
that's
Ms. Lane.
chaotic.
And we'll let you
Thank
pick
you.
that up in the closing. I'm sorry, but
That's great. Thank you.
the time, it's only fair. Okay, number 2, we're going to start with you, Ms. Bailo. And the question is, what is the primary role of the Department of Education in the state's obligation to provide a uniform and complete education to Wyoming students?
Thank you. Excuse me. The law prescribes specifically that the most important decisions in education and about education rest with local school districts and local school boards. As state superintendent, I'll make sure that local school boards and local school districts understand their flexibility and their responsibility to make these decisions. The state must never prescribe nor interfere with local education. That includes prescribing curriculum, teaching materials, supplying leadership outside of the leadership that the state is supposed to supply, and certainly not supplying teachers to local school districts, nor prescribing how grants might need to be written in order to achieve certain aspects or certain successes. The role of the state is simply this: to effectively manage the acquisition and the disbursement of state and federal resources, to provide technical assistance to school districts and many, many important education stakeholders in the state in all areas, to help school districts understand complex state and federal laws, to honor and respect local control, and to effectively communicate and work with diverse partners in our state and in our nation about important educational issues.
Thank you. Mr. Winnie?
Not so long ago, I read an article out of the Wyofile, and it talked about the Robin Hood mode of taking money from the rich counties and giving some of that to the poor counties. So you got to do that. You got to make sure the money is distributed fairly across all the districts on a per-student basis. And that's probably the overarching thing, is to make sure the money is there when the districts need it. But on a bigger note, you have policies and procedures that you have to work from. You have to provide overarching things to the districts. One of the things I've seen the legislature do over the last few years is struggle with how do you put in place an evaluation system. And I had extensive experience with that in my time in the Navy. And I had to learn the Air Force system along the way when I did joint duty, so I saw some of that. And I saw how they were used in selection boards. And I kind of fussed at the legislature about this in some interim committee hearings not so long ago. I said, what are you going to do with these evaluations? What purpose do they serve? You just going to put them in a file cabinet? Maybe drag them out when you decide you want to get rid of somebody? And so I will go after those kind of overarching policies, procedures, and so on that the school districts need to function effectively and deliver excellence with their students.
Thank you. Mr. Ceballos.
The state's role, and the superintendent's in particular, is to lead and balance a group of sometimes conflicting interests. And there's certainly mandates that will come both from the courts, as we've seen in the past, and then also from the legislature. But that has to be balanced with also the understanding that local districts are the ones that teach. They're the ones that engage our students. They're the ones that have to drive it forward. But as you look at this function, then, it is a leadership role. It's to take the resources of the department, understand where you do have compliance issues and do that work, but quickly move from compliance to support, because that's the critical key. When we all can be focused on the student rather than the arguments that we're having, we can come up with great solutions that will help our students succeed. In my estimation, as we look through this, ultimately, if we don't understand that we have to listen, learn, and then work to lead, we'll start at the wrong place. And clearly, again, over the last few years, we've seen that it's been more about disagreement than about student success.
Would anyone like to comment on anyone else's? Oh, I forgot you. This is twice I've done this. They're going to bounce me here. I'm sorry, Ms. Lane.
In the question.
The question I will read again is, what is the primary role of the Department of Education in the state's obligation to provide a uniform and complete education
Thank you.
to Wyoming students?
First and foremost, I think the primary role of the Wyoming Department of Education and all agencies in the government is to serve the people. And the government is by the consent of the people. And we follow the law, for we're governed by the rule of law, not the rule of men. The Constitution calls that that the legislature provide a complete and uniform system, and that means that one of the main functions of the WDE is to flow through about $1.63 billion, a great majority of that amount of money, right out to the schools. And there's been a trend then to become money movers, away from the historical work of the agency to support the supervision of schools. And I think that's unfortunate. Schools suffer without the vision that dollars alone can't supply. I'm poised to fulfill the role of supervisor of Wyoming education, guiding the state toward excellence. I think there are a couple of areas that have been overlooked as we thought about accountability today in the WDE. Teacher certification, which ties to the pre-service, and school accreditation. One's its own agency now, and the other is contracted out by the department to a nonprofit business. Not so long ago, those two functions belonged in the agency, and I think they're vital to accountability. So besides funding, I really believe that we need to align our vision and goals to the will of the people, represented by the elected official, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction.
Thank you, and I apologize again. Anyone have a comment now? No. If not, we'll go to the third question, and we'll begin with you, Mr. Winnie. Do you support the legislature's effort to create a system of accountability for districts, schools, and administrators?
Well, yes, I do support that. However, I don't think the legislature has gotten it right. Not so long ago, we had a meeting here in Cheyenne for the State Superintendents and School Boards Association. And when I had my turn to speak, I gave them a homework assignment. Smile. As I said, I've been around the state talking to people, knocking on doors. I've probably talked to about 250, maybe 300 teachers. And when the Common Core thing comes up, invariably, with precisely one exception, one teacher out of that number said they don't like Common Core because it tells them how to run their classroom. And the night before, when we had a social dinner with those superintendents, I chatted with them, and they had no idea that's what their teachers are thinking. Well, one of the ways you run a good ship is you get out there and talk to your people, you listen for the good ideas, and you do something about it. And so I said, hey, you guys got to resolve this difference here. Another thing that's missing at our legislature's level, there's a quote from a writer and thinker, William J.H. Bettger, in the early 20th century. You can hire men to work for you, and you can employ hands, but you have to win their hearts to get them to work with you. That element is missing in the things I've seen the legislature doing, and I will work to bring that into what we do here in Wyoming.
Mr. Ceballos.
Yes, I do agree with the legislators' focus on accountability. Again, we all have accountability. The courts hold the legislature responsible. Certainly, teachers hold, parents hold teachers, and taxpayers hold elected officials. So really the work here is finding the balance between all of these groups. And a great example is what's happened recently with testing. Clearly there's some demands that have been placed on school districts around testing, the types, numbers, and it's come both from a federal and state level. But when you talk, it's clear that teachers, students, parents, legislators all said there's too much. And it's a great example of where leadership should be able to come in and make the difference. This is a problem we should have been able to solve several years ago, not have to look at today. And that's the type of leadership, if you provide, that I think you can balance that accountability so that we can all move forward in an appropriate way. We are working strongly on these issues as a group, but you have to understand that it will take leadership at the department if you're going to be able to isolate and identify these and then work that through with the legislature. And they've always been reasonable for me to work with.
Thank you. Ms. Lane?
Thank you. I support accountability in schools 100%. There's always been accountability. My great-grandmother taught one-room school and delivered the 8th grade county test to her students. The ultimate accountability is local. It's in the classroom, it's the teacher, the student, and the parents, and that local board and your local leadership. So I believe every educator really believes in and supports accountability if it's fair and clear. And I acknowledge the work of the legislature to do the Wyoming Accountability and Education Act, WAEA for short, but there are problems. I question the motives of policy advisors, state lawyers, lobbyists, the advisory group led by an expensive out-of-state consultant who advised the accountability bill. And why do I question it? Because the bill mirrors the race to the top funding from the feds, Common Core, and the waiver, all of our current president's administration, and all of which circumvented U.S. lawmakers like Enzi who were trying to rework ESEA. And who stands to benefit? In New York, less than 25% of Race to the Top funding ever got to the classroom. It went to consultants and companies and cronies. So I believe that our accountability bill needs to be rethought. It's contradictory and it is complex. I'll tell you, teachers need to be evaluated. And in the simplest terms, you really need to hire good teachers, and then you need to give them what they need, and then you need to get out of the way, and if they cannot deliver, the parents, students, schools know they should be coached up or coached out. That's accountability.
Thank you. Ms. Balo.
Would you repeat the question,
I surely
please?
will. That's right, and and for the audience as well. Do you support the legislature's efforts to create a system of accountability for districts, schools, and administrators?
Absolutely. It's hard to argue the idea of accountability. We expect it from the Wyoming Department of Transportation, from medicine, from the business world. It's all around us. Our legislature has taken on the task of creating the Wyoming accountability system in lieu of a Washington bureaucrat coming in and judging our system and telling us what's wrong with our education system. I applaud the legislature's effort. I believe that over the last 4 years, what has happened is that there is a lack of leadership, a lack of collaboration that has led to our legislature taking tighter reins than they would like in education. I believe that with better leadership in the Department of Education and by the state superintendent, we will begin to work with our accountability system as a starting point and not an ending point for state accountability. I prefer a state voice. I prefer to advocate and not be in conflict with the legislature, and I believe that it's the superintendent's responsibility and duty to advocate for quality education and quality accountability. Some of the perks of a state accountability system include we have the opportunity to be nimble to the needs and uniqueness of 48 school districts. We can customize it to make our own, and it belongs to us, the 48 school districts in the state of Wyoming.
Thank you. Would you like me to repeat the question, Mr. Winnie?
He already went.
I think it's getting too late. Well, I'll tell you what. Really, the first one went pretty well. You wouldn't believe it, but.
How long have you been on the campaign trail?
Yeah, I'm just starting in flashbacks here. All right, now, and somebody raise a hand if I'm wrong about this, but is it Mr. Sabias' turn?
I'll raise my hand.
No.
I'm
All
next.
right. Okay. Well, I was giving him a chance to pop up when I was talking about my errors, but, well, we did get a few sparks there, so do you want to comment? Anyone? Well, all right. Now we will start with Mr. Sabias. This is a long one. We may have to read this twice during the course. The Constitution gives the legislature the responsibility to fund schools and facilities at a level that assures all children a quality education. Yet, the Constitution also tasks the superintendent with general supervision of education. How do you see the relationship between the superintendent of public instruction and the legislature?
Both the Constitution and common sense would tell you that the legislature and the superintendent need to work together. That is a formula for success. In all of my years here, I've spent much time with the legislature, and they have had many conflictive issues that they've had to deal with, parties that had different feelings about subjects. But when you have good leadership, you can go into a group like the legislature and present your position, but also present what others are talking about. And that's how you really start to inform the legislature to be able to do those things and to follow the lead and to have confidence, again, in the department. What we've really seen over the last 4 years is, again, it's been more about the conflict and just less about the outcomes. And that's what we have to focus on if we're going to get there. The legislature does not want to be balmed up in this big morass of problems that we've seen. They'd like us to move forward, and I think that we have a great opportunity to respect one another and to be able to learn from one another. That is a skill that I specifically bring to this job, and I know we can do better than we've had here in the recent past.
Thank you. Ms. Lane, would you like me to read the question again?
I'm good. Unless the audience, it's a long one. I thank you for this question because it helps clarify again the role between the superintendent and the legislature. According to the Constitution, the legislature funds education and the superintendent supervises schools, and that's the Supreme Court came down clearly about that. I think the challenge arises when the legislature adds to the funding task and begins to control education that the students receive. And legislators around the state on the campaign trail have sought me out, called, we've met, and they've been visiting about this. And their real concern that they want kids educated well and they want the clarity of their function. And I think that this work requires a leader with a great deal of hands-on experience from top to bottom, if there is such a thing as top to bottom in education, from the teacher's perspective, from a district leadership perspective, and from the Wyoming Department of Ed's perspective, where we had a big budget of $1.63 billion biennial and 158 employees. So I think what we need is an educator. We need to have a lot of really healthy conversations between the legislature, the State Board of Education, and the WDE. And together, we need to line up our pencils in the same direction because the kids are at stake. And every moment not teaching them is a moment that's irreparably lost.
Thank you. Ms. Balo, do you want me to repeat the question?
That would be fantastic, please.
All right. I surely will. The Constitution gives the legislature responsibility to fund schools and facilities at a level that assures all children a quality education. Yet, the Constitution also tasks the superintendent with general supervision of education. How do you see the relationship between the superintendent of public instruction and the legislature?
This balance does not need to be adversarial. It is adversarial right now, but as soon as the legislature and the superintendent of public instruction and other stakeholders establish clear targets and take collective responsibility for education, disagreements will be fruitful and they will lead to more productive results. Here's the skill set that voters should expect coming into the state superintendent's office: competence and experience to implement policy and make recommendations that will lead to better policy in Wyoming. Skills to promote and advocate for sound education policy with the legislature, and the skills to articulate those policies and the actions to the public. A willingness to collaborate with stakeholders with differing opinions. A willingness to work together. These are the skills that are critical, and I possess those skills. Not only do I tell you that I possess them, I have a record of possessing them. While at the Department of Family Services, I've led groups, I've led staff, I've worked with the legislature, and I have the credibility and the ability to refocus and move education forward in Wyoming.
Thank you. Mr. Winnie, would you like me to read the question?
No, I'm good.
All right.
I've got it right here. In our system of government, it is important that the governor and his staff and the top 5 electeds take due notice of the fact that the governor and all the rest of them propose and the legislature disposes. That in turn entails a professional and courteous dialogue, a frequent dialogue between the superintendent of public instruction in this case and the legislators, a give and take. The superintendent has to have a vision of where he wants to go. The superintendent has to be able to lay out that vision in front of the legislators. He's got to be willing to listen to them because they have good ideas too sometimes. I've heard a lot of parents that don't agree with that, but nevertheless, you get the idea. And you go back and forth. And sometimes you go around that block 3 or 4 or 5 times. And so at the end of the day, the way you work with those guys to put in place your vision as the superintendent, the way you communicate it to them, and the professionalism and courtesy with which you interact with them on a day-by-day basis will help the legislature do what they've been trying to do for a decade, which is solve a weakness in education here in Wyoming.
Thank you. And now I'm going to remember, if you'd like to comment on anyone else's answer, we'll entertain it.
I would just again like to better understand, because I did hear what Ms. Lane had said about the problems with the legislature, but then what was the fatal problem? What did we need to do different so that we didn't have the train wreck that we've had for the last few years? What was the missing piece? Was it just educators with not administrative skills? Was it just arguing for the sake of arguing? What caused the problem? Because I think we could all learn a lot from that.
Ms. Lane, would you
Shall
like
I
to
answer?
comment?
And how many seconds do I have? 30?
30.
3 seconds.
30. Oh, 3. No. 30.
You know, when the current administration went into the Department of Ed, someone is famous for saying that no one has any idea how many grenades are rolled under that person's chair. And that is partly because of a rush toward federalizing with the Common Core that had not gone through rules promulgation and yet had already been announced to all the districts in the state who were already going to their local boards to get started. It was a train wreck by, I believe, a prior administration's shuffling around with Common Core in order to get Race to the Top funding.
Thank you. Anyone else choose to comment?
I would like to comment, please.
Go ahead.
All right, I heard my opponent mention that being the superintendent of public instruction was supervising schools. I think it's important to note that organizations such as the Department of Education fail when there isn't a strong governance structure. We've seen the beginnings of failing of an organization over the last 4 years, and it's important that we do not go down that road. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lane, I'm going to start with you on question 5. Where is the balance between statewide assurance/funding of quality education and local control by school districts, parents, and community?
It's a good question. The Constitution is clear that the control is at the local level, and we simply can't surrender that control to the feds nor to the state. It's a constitutional principle. By the way, it is supported by a whole gamut of research out there that suggests that authority and autonomy must remain in the classroom, in the schools, and in local districts. So it's for authority and autonomy to even happen, for kids to learn, the control really needs to be at that focus in the classroom. It's an unfortunate reality today that our school districts are reduced to having to hire lobbyists to have conversations with the legislature about cost adjustments, for instance. There's just plenty to do for the legislature to deal with issues of funding of the public schools, not micromanaging. And I'll go back to my comments on accountability. Quality education resides again with the students and parents. And when the federal and state regulations get too onerous, we find ourselves in situations with hours and hours of time and thousands of dollars spent on the exercise of demonstrating accountability as opposed to really practicing it. So I think to fix this, we need an authentic conversation with our parents and our communities about what we expect from our schools and how we're going to measure those expectations. No Child Left Behind took us far enough down the pathway of relinquishing control of the daily lives of schools and costly and time-consuming assessments, followed by data collections. And Common Core is far more intrusive than No Child Left Behind ever thought of being.
Thank you. Ms. Baylor.
Thank you. It's quite clear in Wyoming statute as well as in our Constitution that the delivery of a quality education is in the hands of the local school districts. In Wyoming, we have a system that works to ensure that. Through a block grant, local districts have adequate funding, and this is not regulated by the state. In fact, every year, local school districts are required to take public input from their community on how best to spend those dollars. So this is a well-balanced process, and the power lies with the people. I am a big proponent of power lying with the people, of local control, and I will vigilantly uphold that. What I also see is that we have, through the block grant, we have funding opportunities to meet state standards in a variety of different ways. All 48 districts meet those standards very uniquely according to the needs, the desires, and the wants of their local communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Winnie?
Well, the balance, of course, starts out with that Robin Hood funding thing I mentioned from WireFile, where the counties that don't have quite as much tax base get some extra money from the counties that have more of a tax base. And so that's the basic amount of money that goes out to each district, and the school board gets to apportion that as they wish in order to deliver the things that they need to deliver. But the legislature also has an ability to do a few things beyond that. Some years ago, they put in place a program for instructional facilitators that are funded 75% by the state. The districts don't have to take advantage of it, but if they do have to have a little skin in the game and put some of their own money in. And so they give the local control where it belongs to the school district. That's a bedrock of how Wyoming's system is set up. Well, those are good ideas. What else can you do? The legislature needs to do stuff like that when they can, but they got to be careful they don't get too far into the details and keep the school boards where they are, which is in charge.
Thank you. Mr. Sabias.
Local control for me is an opportunity, not a problem, as it's been described. When we really look at this, the local legislators are the ones that are there sitting in their kitchens with people come knocking on their doors, and to start with the assumption that somehow this group of folks doesn't want schools to be effective is to me a little far-fetched. That doesn't mean that the legislators have all the knowledge, but if you treat them like the enemy, then they will ultimately act like the enemy. The opportunity here is to work with that group and to regain some trust that has been lost. We need to go back and sit down with the legislators and ask them what their questions are and compare that with what we're hearing and sharing what we're hearing at a local level. When you can combine those two pieces together, what we have is tremendous opportunity, not conflict. As you look at it, we know that we have to, at a local community level, answer the question when the student comes to us, why do I need to learn this? And if our local communities aren't embedded in this and our legislators understand that, then that's what creates graduation rates that drop and remediation rates that go up. We have an opportunity here to work with them. There's not a problem, there's an opportunity.
Thank you. Anyone want to comment? Well, now we'll go to the last league question here. And Ms. Bailey, you'll be the first one. As a statewide elected official, you will sit on the State Loan and Investment Board and the Board of Land Commissioners. What policy positions do you bring to granting loan and grant requests from local governments? What positions do you bring to decisions about school trust lands? It's a long question.
A long question indeed. Thank you. I'm blessed. As a policy advisor in the Governor's Board, I was a liaison to the SLIB Board. I understand the process. I believe in the process. I think that the process of allocating money to local governments through the various boards that the top 5 elected officials sit on is such a unique and great opportunity for state government, industry, and local governments and communities to work together to achieve our economic goals. I cannot stress enough the importance and the obligation that we have as Wyoming voters to elect 5 top leaders, not candidates who are closely connected with other campaigns or candidates in other races. This does not display the kind of leadership that we need on these boards. The top 5 elected officials manage the trust lands. Of those trust lands, 90% approximately go to schools. Those fund those go in the foundation, and those pay for the education, the crux of the education for our students, and they pay for capital construction for our school buildings. Land trust revenues, most of which come through minerals, are imperative to our schools. As one of the 5 leaders working shoulder to shoulder with the other leaders, local governments, will look at land issues case by case, and I am committed to always making sure that we have a return on our investment and a steady stream for education.
Thank you. Would you like me to repeat the question, Mr. Winnie? Thank you.
Nope, I'm good. Thank you. Probably the biggest thing I bring to the State Loan and Investment Board is a consideration of the tax base. When we spoke in front of the Wyoming Association of Municipalities, I spoke about the counties with the smaller tax bases being in need of grants rather than loans and things like that. And boy, I must have seen about 5 or 6 heads nod in the audience when I talked about that. And so I would look at things that are brought in front of that from the perspective of what's the tax base and the ability of the local community to generate the funds themselves versus having it come from the state. The other thing is, we talk about school trust land. I've watched our legislature now for several years struggle with the two parcels, I think it's two, out there in the Grand Teton National Park that are islands within the park. And they got surrounded when the park was created. And it's, what do we do with them? How do we maximize the money, the return? Because that return has to go to the schools. And those are relatively unproductive parcels right now, and so they're trying to figure out how to do something with it. The object is clear. You maximize the return on those parcels to support the school systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ceballos.
Yes, the policy positions I would bring to this are those that I bring as a business executive. You really learn as a president of a company about why it's important to have limited government and the necessity to push back when that doesn't happen. You also learn to be fiscally conservative, particularly as our taxes are generated here. But when you look at all of these positions, you have to start with an open mind. You don't have a bias. You're looking at what's being presented to you because you understand of the importance that these boards play in the state. I've had just extreme experience in all of these. As the chairman of the Business Alliance, we worked on multiple use, so you understand the importance of how you use our public lands. As the president of the Taxpayers Association, you understand the problems between tax versus spend and what you have to do to be careful with that. And then as Leeds, the chairman of our Economic Development Group, how important these funds are to help our state grow and prosper. So I think I'm uniquely qualified for this position, and truly, as you look at the school trust land, you know that this is a major source for our schools, and it has to be managed carefully and treasured.
Ms. Lane.
Thank you. I believe that I have a responsibility as elected official to treat the school trust land as if it were my own, as if I owned it, as if it the land that the people have. And so trust lands are something like Section 16 and 36 out of every township that it's allotted. On very rare occasions, these come up for sale or come up to be traded or whatever, and the process involves the bureaucracy. The Game and Fish writes off on it, the Forestry Division, and so forth. And I just want to say that I think it's terribly important that the ultimate responsibility would be with me to represent the best interest of the people. With the State Land and Investment Board, or SLIB, because I have the principles that read like this: I believe in individual rights, I believe in individual initiative, I believe in fiscal responsibility, and so forth, and that the government is best, it's closest to the people. I wonder about some things about the State Land and Investment Board. I want the government to be closest to the people. We need to ensure predictable, clear, and certain methods so entities can plan ahead. I think most of the work should be done on infrastructure for economic development, and those entities that are seeking funds should have some skin in the game. I wish we would avoid winners and losers at the state level and avoid unintended consequences, which are in some communities, such as Lusk. So I sometimes wonder if we could have a formula to move the money more directly to the counties and municipalities rather than have folks come hat in hand to Cheyenne.
Thank you. Anyone wish to comment? Now we are going to turn to questions from the audience. This will be a test of your penmanship here, if I can read this. And we will start with, we started with Ms. Lane, we'll start with Ms. Balo. What is the value of statewide academic standards which guide districts in writing curricula? Who should write the standards? What are your thoughts about science, standards, and the Common Core? Boy, that's a master's thesis then. All right. Ms. Balo. All right, well, with no extra time, we might say, but.
All right, that is cumbersome. I couldn't even catch up. Could I please ask you to repeat the question so that I can just make sure that I cover it?
It's really sort of a three-part question.
It is.
One is, what is the value of statewide academic standards which guide districts in writing curriculum? That's one. Two, who should write those standards? And three, what are your thoughts about science standards and Common Core? Boy, somebody in the audience wants to start a fight here tonight. This is a very good question. So, Ms. Balo, got it?
Great. And I have a minute and a half, is that right? Okay. I'm going to start backwards and work up. The Common Core and the Next Generation Science Standards are both off-the-shelf sets of standards. In Wyoming, we know we can do things better. As I am out talking with folks, that is exactly how it feels. Every step that we take toward a cookie-cutter approach or toward the Common Core is a step away from local control. I am in favor, as an educator and a leader, of high standards for our students, the highest standards for our students. That's how we know that they're successful in school, and we know that they can compete globally once they're out of school, or stay in Wyoming if they choose. As far as the value of academic standards and who should write them in Wyoming, we have a process in place. Unfortunately, it's clear that many voices were not heard in the last standards adoption process. We need to have a more robust process through strong facilitated leadership by the state superintendent that is inclusive of all voices. I'll do that as superintendent by going to the communities, conducting focus groups shoulder to shoulder with the local school boards and community members, and the results of those discussions will serve as the centerpiece for decision making around standards. I expect that in 2017 we will have standards that do not look like the Common Core standards, but that embody Wyoming's values and high, strong standards.
Thank you. Mr.
I guess
Winnie,
I'll
want
stop
me to
there.
read it again?
Yeah, I think you better.
Okay. What is the value of statewide academic standards which guide districts in writing curricula? Who should write the standards? And what are your thoughts about science standards and Common Core?
Well, the state has an interest in providing an overarching system with regard to the standards that the local school boards actually write. The school boards write the details, but the state ought to give them a framework within which to work. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, Common Core, wrap that all together. I described to you my homework assignment for the superintendents. You know, we got the teachers here with one view as Common Core, or the Next Generation Science Standards, if you will. You got the superintendents somewhere else, and you got, I can tell you from the parents I've talked to, you got them in another place. If I was going to solve that problem, and there would be state standards, well, there would be a state framework within which standards are written, I would get a representative sample of teachers, a representative sample of administrators, a representative sample of parents, and some college educators too, and I'd toss them all in a room and I'd tell them they could have all the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches they want. They could have all the coffee or other beverages they want, but they can't come out until they figure out how to make it work. How's that?
I can't comment, but I'm sure someone else will.
I didn't expect you to, but you get it.
Mr. Sabais.
Yes, we absolutely have to have standards, and we've done this for decades with education. If you think about one standard, one's a driver's license. What would it be like if we had no standard for what a stop sign was going to be? Standards are critical, and the tougher the standard for our students in the 21st century, the better. Who writes those standards should be made up of a lot of folks. When we look at the medical profession, we don't just say who in Wyoming has good ideas. You take everybody's good ideas. You're looking for the best ideas. The critical point then is when you take them back to ask, now what fits us? But the idea of rejecting something because it comes from a different place just seems to me not what you would best want to do. Science standards, the math standards, the language arts standards, even the group here in town that's opposing these uses a rating group. Our current standards for language arts, math, and science were F, D, and F. They rated, the same rating agency that they used rated the new standards an A, a B, and a C. And I just have to tell you, anytime I could get a chance to move my student from an F up, I'm going to do it every time. I think that they are something that we can always improve. But if you just stop there, stop the school bus, you're definitely throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of good.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've had standards in Wyoming since approximately 1999, and I served with Judy Catchpole at that point in time, coming from the district, to write the first set of standards in the state for language arts. They were much leaner. I am simply not aware of any grading system that graded them as Fs. They were well written. The input came from nearly 100 stakeholders in Wyoming. The standard doesn't tell you how high to read. It tells you the process for reading. It expresses a value. We've had standards. They were informed by stakeholders. They were informed by our professional organizations out there. And yet, we still hear complaints in our state that we're not doing a good enough job in education. So I think there's so much more to the story of educating kids than standards. Oftentimes a standard sits here, as in Common Core, as a way to get to an assessment, a national assessment, a state assessment, as a way to get to teacher evaluation, as a way to collect data. And too often, none of that system really grows kids. So I would like to maintain that we have leaner standards at the state level and a leaner assessment at the state level with way more public input in our state, and that we focus then on supporting our schools so that every single student does have a fabulous education.
Thank you. Anyone wish to comment on anyone's answers?
I would say on this topic in particular, it is so complicated because there's great confusion between a standard, how it's approved, and it absolutely, in our law, it's required 4 times to have the public involved. And if we're not doing that well enough, and I don't think we are, then we should do more with it. But that once you get that standard, everything about how it's implemented by law is done at the district. And so if you say I think those are all good things, a standard that we agree on that's implemented at the district. And we ought not confuse the subject because I think it hurts our citizens.
Ms. Lane.
The problem was that in 2009, before the standards were ever even written, the new Common Core standards, the former superintendent, the former chief, sent out to all the districts in the state and all the leadership in the state that we were going to adopt Common Core standards that did not follow the rules. We had not gone through rule promulgation. We did not have public input. So the cart was so far the cart was behind the horse, or whichever way that goes. And, you know, there are rules for a reason, and we needed to follow them. That alone causes chaos in state education.
Thank you. That is quite a complicated issue. We're going to shift gear. Oh, I'm sorry. You have a comment, too. Sorry, Ms. Paley. Go ahead.
That's okay. I would like to note that the review process was going on when the new administration came in, and in September of 2011, the current administration did vote in favor of adopting the Common Core state standards, and then voted again in 2012 not to move ahead with those. I also think that it is important to say that the most well-intentioned, best standards in the world are not worth using if the public will is not there, and it is my absolute belief that the public does not want the Common Core standards and believes we can do better.
Now, on a different topic, another question from the audience, and we will start with you, Mr. Winnie. Could you work with all underlined members of the legislature, especially the Education Committee?
Yes. In a real sense, I kind of have. As a private citizen, I mentioned I'd been there observing these guys for 10 years. You know, somebody's got to keep their eye on those guys. And from my experience in Washington, D.C. arena while I was on active duty, I didn't like the political process. And that's why I did that. I was there first day to last day. I saw my share of paint dry, by the way. But I have spoken up in public comment. I started doing that about 6 years ago. And I spoke on various things. For instance, I spoke with Chairman Matt Teeters one day walking back from the Hirschler building through the tunnel to the main building on Senate File 104. I said, hey, Chairman Teeters, this isn't the right way to do business. And he remarked back to me that it was similar to what they did to the state auditor in 1991. And I said, yeah, okay, you got away with it then. That doesn't make it right now. And I've had other minor interchanges with them, again, as a private citizen where I express my opinion and speaking up on public comment. And they kind of know how I think. I don't think they necessarily agree with me, but that's okay. It's the give and take you got to work with. So yeah, I can work with those guys.
Thank you. Mr. Ceballos.
One of the challenges that have come out of these last few years is, again, the conflict that's there. And my 15-year experience with working with the legislature is kind of you can go in there with a presupposed idea, and then you can deliver that if you want. But what I've seen is this is a group of tremendous citizens, and they are doing the very best they can with the information that we provide them. They're dedicated. They're certainly not paid for the amount of time that they do this, and they work very hard to understand complex issues. The challenge that you have then is, how do you approach them? Do you approach them as a team member, and how do we get forward with this, or do you take another approach? And I think the legislature is, again, the most local group of folks we have. They hear regularly from those folks in communities, and that's why there's such a good connection. We shouldn't at the Department of Ed think we're the only ones that have good ideas about education, because they're talking to their local communities probably more than we are. That's a team that absolutely you can work with, and it's been my experience and my great luck to be able to do that successfully throughout my entire 15 years.
Thank you. Ms. Lane.
You know, I believe, yes, the answer is, in Bill Winnie's words, is yes. It will be imperative to work with every member of the legislature, and this is particularly important with the Joint Education Committee. And the legislators have talked to me. Some have talked to me on the road, and they express a real concern that we do collaborate, that we do talk about what happens when we, for instance, have add in a computer-based assessment in the law, and then what are the consequences out there in the classrooms? What does it look like in kindergarten when kindergartners now take about 40 days of testing? I think that there's a need for open dialogue, need for trust. I really think that I share much in common with the legislature right now, with integrity and fiscal responsibility and personal responsibility. I think that in the end, we all believe in local control, and because that's the only place for excellence to go to work. So the answer is we will work together, because not to is too big of a loss.
Thank you. Ms. Palo.
Could you repeat the question,
sure
please?
Could you work with all members of the legislature, especially the Education Committee, or Joint Education Committee?
Thank you. Perhaps the best way to respond would be to just share a story and an experience. When I was at the Department of Education, the Reading Assessment and Intervention under my leadership, that program went under a management evaluation audit, basically a program audit by the Legislative Service Office and the Management Committee. As a department at the time, we viewed that opportunity, which lasted over a year and hundreds of staff hours, as an opportunity to improve, as an opportunity to recognize and acknowledge that these were our legislators who were asking for this audit, and they were speaking and representing Wyoming citizens. Instead of creating a conflicting or friction environment, we worked together to make reading assessment and intervention better. The process, again, lasted over a year. The follow-up was scheduled to last 3 years. 2011, fast forward, we were required to be in front of the Management Audit Council quarterly, In 2011, I attempted to get our work from the Management Audit Committee as a department in front of the current leadership, and it was returned on my desk. Not once, not twice, not even 3 times. I'm the one who called the LSO and said, we're not going to be testifying you or giving an update because we are not able to continue going down the road to improvement that we set out together. That's a problem. I'll work with the legislature, not against.
Anyone want to comment? Now I've got a hot one for you here. In fact, here's another 2-part question. They're getting their money's worth out of you people tonight. All right, 2-part question. First, do you favor or oppose the teaching of creationism in the classroom? And 2, what do we do as far as revenue if Wyoming declines federal education funds? And Mr. Ceballos, this hot potato is going to you first.
Sure. And in fact, this has been one of the issues, creationism, that has caused us not to be able to agree on the science standard. And it seems to me it's something we've talked about for a very long time. And that schools have worked this out. In many cases, you can offer to parents that don't want that subject to be set aside. And that's how local districts have been dealing with this. There are options to it. But if what you say is that if that somehow is one of the problems, then we shouldn't adopt a science standard again as you're looking at that. Those are the kinds of things where I really do think we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I think there's ways to deal with the most controversial subject and respect that you're going to have parents that have different perspectives, and there ought to be a way to fix that. In terms of the revenue dollars that are there, you know, our revenue dollars still from feds, when you look at all that we spend, are not a great number. When you look at both state, federal, and local dollars, that they're today somewhere around $1.8 billion in a biennium. And the amount that we're getting from the feds, if you really wanted to say we don't like to do what you're doing, you give them away, you could. The problem will be with districts and how do you make it up. But I think that that could be a discussion if we got to the legislature and we felt that there was just too many onerous rules. That could be one of the options, as well as suing.
Thank you. Ms. Lane, want me to read it again? Or?
I think I'm fine, thank you. Talking here about teaching in the schools, creationism versus evolution or global warming, issues that are controversial. I want you to know that teaching out there with those students, that the more controversial it is, the more chaos that happens around controversy in the classroom makes it very hard to teach. The bottom line is, it's not about whether or not I believe in creationism or whether or not I believe in global warming, but instead, local control about setting that curriculum. And so I'm worried about the NGSS standards because they're very dense, and they really do, when you read them, intrude in on curriculum. So the local districts have to respond to the parents, their concerns, their communities. In here, in this district, 10 or 15 kids leave during the science unit. And I feel like what we have to do, I never did teach science, what we have to do is to figure out a way as teachers to be able to teach the students in front of us and their parents who stand as shadows behind them. And that's really important. They get to have the final say, your local board and your parents, about when do we teach issues that they find controversial, and how do we do that. As an English teacher, for instance, if I were teaching theme and somebody didn't want me to teach the grapes of wrath, I could probably accomplish it with great expectations. It would be very important to be nimble about what we do on a daily level so that I can have all the ears of my students
Okay, we'll have
awake.
to cut you off, and we'll give you another opportunity on the funding later. Ms. Balo, want me to read it again?
One more time, please.
All right, I'll be glad to. Do you favor or oppose the teaching of creationism in the classroom? And 2, what do we do as far as revenue if Wyoming declines federal education dollars?
Great. As a state superintendent, I don't believe that it's my position or responsibility to either favor or oppose teaching creationism in the classroom. The standards are the finish line. How we train to get to the finish line, how we train to do the race is up to each district locally. Let's make those decisions locally. As far as federal funds, as a state administrator, both in the Department of Education as well as in the governor's office and now at the Department of Family Services, I've turned away federal funding excuse me, when Wyoming cannot sustain after the life of a grant or a funding opportunity, and or when it doesn't align with our goals. Much of the federal funding that Wyoming receives aligns with our goals. Let's take, for example, Title I funds. Those benefit at-risk kids. They align with our goals as a state. They aren't onerous, don't have too many strings attached that we don't already do, don't create a lot of duplication in work, and we ought to be seeking those funds. We pay into the federal tax system as well, and those are all our dollars as well. Let me give you another example. Our state applied for a grant for early childhood. I recommended to the governor that we not move forward on that grant because we could not sustain after the life of that grant. It's important to look at every funding opportunity singularly and decide how onerous it is, how many strings are attached, and if we can sustain with state dollars.
Thank you. Mr. Winnie? You want me to read the question again?
Yeah, you better.
Two-part. One, do you favor or oppose the teaching of creationism in the classroom? Two, what do we do as far as revenue if Wyoming declines federal education funds?
Okay, first part of that. How our school boards solve the problem of teaching science to our young people is the school board's problem, the local board. One of the objections I've seen with regard to next generation science standards, I attended a thing up in Casper, golly, it must have been 6 weeks ago now, is that the next generation science standard proposes to give the answers to students as to what the science means. I've long objected to that as a methodology of teaching. You should let our young people draw their own conclusions. And when you get down to how a local school board decides to handle the creationism versus evolution versus whatever else, that's their business. And it's not our job up here at the state level to get into that level of detail with them. Federal funds. In part, federal funds is a political decision. There's a couple things you got to keep in mind. Bureaucracies are always trying to control you, and they use money to do that. I've seen my share of that in my time in the Washington, D.C. arena. But sometimes they give you this grant, and then you have to pick up the funds later afterwards. We have a sizable chunk of our state education budget that comes from the federal level. And we have to be very careful that we as an education, the Department of Education properly prepares to ask for those if appropriate, but at the end that's a political decision whether we take the money or not.
Thank you. Anyone wish to comment on the other's answer? Ms. Lane?
To Mr. Winnie, it's about 6% of the budget. It comes from federal monies. And we can certainly, we're so very lucky in Wyoming, we can certainly cover for that if we need to, if the federal strings are too onerous or if it doesn't match the values of Wyoming parents and communities. So that's, I think, it puts it in perspective exactly where we are with that.
Thank you. Do you want to comment back?
Yeah.
Surely.
6% isn't quite right. For instance, the federal funds, the mineral funds that come in from the federal is like $100 million bucks. If you take the thing in toto, it's a good bit bigger than that.
We have some very good questions here. We don't have time, but I think you candidates should get a copy of these because it would be good to be able to answer them. So now we will have you do your 2-minute closing. You're free to cover any subject you want, and Ms. Lane, we'll start with you.
During these last 4 years at the Wyoming Department of Education, not quite 4, what we had happen was scores went up in the state. They went up in every content area, and they went up in every grade level. We reverted about $1 million back, which is unheard of. Both of those two are unheard of. We reverted $1 million back to the state. We had a settlement with Pearson, the assessment company, and $2.7 million was applied against what we owed them from the prior administration of the assessment. We scrutinized every single federal program for federal strings, and we put students before the bureaucracy. We put parents before federal strings. If I am elected, we will go back to the notion that it's wonderful Wyoming has got exemplar teachers who can pass the torch on to other teachers in our state, and that wave will mean that our kids benefit. So I think that we are at a crossroads in Wyoming education. You can elect me, someone who deeply knows how schools work and how improvement happens, what classrooms and schools from K through 12 look like, and what we can learn from one another. When you elect me, you have an executive with a vision. I know the goal, and I know how to get there. I know who must be empowered to deliver that excellent instruction. I know how to explain that to the legislature and the governor. I know Wyoming education, and I love it. When you elect me, we will work together. And guess what? Our students will learn, and they will love the learning. They will become better citizens. They'll become better workers as they take advantage of the wealth of college and career training options out there for our lucky kids. Together, we can have the best teachers, the best schools, and the best students in America.
Thank you. Ms. Palo.
Thank you. Excuse me. I'm a candidate in this race because I'm uniquely qualified to bring the necessary leadership to the Department of Education, to the State Superintendent's Office, and to the state of Wyoming that is so dearly needed right now to heal and move education forward. Two things need to happen. We need to heal a broken Department of Education and broken partnerships across the state, and we need to move education forward. I'm running on 4 planks to a platform: enhancing local control, too many top-down mandates from the state level right now across the board. Those are a result of leadership not collaborating with one another, and at the helm is the state superintendent. I'm running on enhanced parental control. As a teacher, enhanced parental involvement. As a teacher, I know that when my families were involved in their children's education, that was the heart of their success, and their success went up. I'm also running on tackling the controversial politics that have overtaken the education system in Wyoming for the past 4 years. When you open the paper in the morning, I want you to read about the successes and challenges in education, not the successes and challenges and the wins and losses in politics and education. I will collaborate with educational partners, some educational partners who haven't been collaborated with during this past administration and maybe even years before that. I've made tough choices to be in this race. I'm a mom of 2 children who are in public school, and they are thriving this summer. They've been on the campaign trail with me, and they're doing well, but it's been tough as a mom. I'm running because I'm an educator, and I know we can do better. As a mom, I know we can do better. My children have accessed services, and I've felt the challenges of our education system. I've dealt with those at the local level, and I want to create a governance structure at the state level to make sure that local successes continue to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Winnie.
When I've spoken in front of some of those committees in the legislature on some of the bills, I've said this bill, whatever it might be, is about what we want Wyoming to look like in a generation. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is how we get there. And it's our young people that are going to get us to whatever that vision is that we have of Wyoming. One of the ways I did business on my ships was get the system out of the way of the wrench turners. Well, here we're talking about teachers, we're talking about professionals, but you get the idea. If you want to see what kind of ships I ran, there's a tab on my website, billwhinney.org, labeled Excellence, and you'll see some stuff that will tell you a thing about how I did business. One of the issues we face is bureaucracies want to control. That's how bureaucracies work. It's in their blood. The things I will do, I will work to gain the confidence of the legislature and move them away from being what I've seen in them, a super school board. A small note in there, the testing burden. We've got too much testing. You've heard that before. I said that in a guest column in the Casper paper. Testing, testing, testing. Be careful what you ask for. You might get it. I will build a system that teachers can trust. If you look at the dichotomy between what the superintendents think that I heard and what the teachers think that I heard at the front door, and the fact that the superintendents were not aware of that, there's something that needs to be done there. And then I pulled up the article, the wildfire article I spoke of. The number is 42% in that article of federal funds, direct and indirect.
Thank you. Mr. Ceballos.
Yes, and I think we'd all like to thank the League of Women Voters for doing this. It's hard work to be able to get out and talk to folks, and we appreciate you giving us that chance. This job fits me to a T. As I look at part of it, it really is a management job, and that's leading teams. And I've led teams of subject matter experts, people that you have to depend on because they make decisions for you, and you have to support them. I've worked with the legislature, with the governor, with the Board of Education. These are places that I'm familiar, and I have a track record of being able to work with them. That doesn't mean always saying yes, but that does mean getting to yes, figuring out how to work through a problem. I have a limited government background, and it's simply because I've been the president of a company that's 10 times had to sue the government to say don't do that anymore, and I've won 9 of the 10, so I understand why limited government's important and why your local communities are so critical. I've developed a passion for education because of my parents, because of what I've been able to experience here, and the last 3 years working on my doctorate over at UW at the College of Ed in Ed Leadership. Education is not a partisan issue. It is an issue of focusing on our students, and that's what we've got to return to, not arguments, but results. If you'd like to know more about me, you can go to mikeforeducation.com, and I would ask for your vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before we all leave the room, I think we should thank these men and women for running and for their answers. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Marguerite always has a final word from our sponsor.
I think we should also thank Kathy Carpin for her able navigation. Indeed, thank you for the candidates, the people who are here in the audience and watching online, and who will continue to watch us, we hope, over the next weeks until the election. Tomorrow night is the forum for governors, so we hope you'll be back. We hope to fill the room again. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for trying to get informed about your government, because it is our government. Thank you very much, and good night.